In the summer of 1518, Strasbourg was already a city running on very little patience. Years of poor harvests had left people hungry, recurring outbreaks of disease had made death feel routine, and fear had slowly worked its way into everyday life. Suffering was rarely seen as random. Most people believed it meant judgment, that if something went wrong, someone had done something to deserve it. In that kind of atmosphere, strange behavior didn't immediately stand out. It blended in, which may be why what happened next didn't cause alarm right away. One morning, a woman later recorded in city documents as Frau Trophia stepped into the narrow street outside her home and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, no announcement. Her movements weren't graceful or joyful. They were stiff, uneven, almost uncomfortable to watch. At first, people reacted the way people usually do when something doesn't make sense. They laughed. A few assumed it was a performance. Others thought it was a private joke they weren't in on. After all, one woman behaving oddly in a city full of misery didn't seem like a priority. The problem was, she didn't stop. Hours passed. Frau Trophia kept moving, her steps growing heavier, her balance less certain. By evening, the laughter had faded into confusion. By nightfall, curiosity had turned into concern. She hadn't eaten, she hadn't rested, and still she danced. The next day, neighbors tried to intervene. Some attempted to pull her indoors, others spoke to her gently, as if reason might suddenly work if delivered carefully enough. She resisted without aggression, continuing to move even as her body showed clear signs of exhaustion. Witnesses later disagreed on one detail. Some said her expression was blank. Others said it looked painfully aware. Either way, it was clear she wasn't enjoying herself. Local authorities were informed, but their response was cautious, almost indifferent. Strasbourg had seen public breakdowns before. Religious fervor, hunger-induced madness, emotional collapse, none of it was new. One woman dancing herself to exhaustion did not yet feel like a crisis. Then, another person began to dance. Soon after, a third joined. They were not related. They did not arrive together. There was no shared explanation. And yet, their movements mirrored one another in unsettling ways. The same tension, the same inability to stop. Within days, a small crowd had formed. Some dancers collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again moments later. Shoes wore through, feet bled. Still, the movement continued, as if stopping had become physically impossible. At this point, fear spread faster than understanding. Clergy warned of divine punishment. Physicians spoke of bodily imbalance and overheated blood. Ordinary citizens had their own explanations. Curses, demons, moral decay. Everyone had a theory. No one had a solution. By the end of the first week, the situation turned deadly. Reports emerged of dancers collapsing and not rising again. Deaths were attributed to heart failure, dehydration, and sheer physical exhaustion. The city was no longer dealing with a strange sight. It was dealing with loss. What Strasbourg most unsettled was not the dancing itself. It was the growing realization that no one knew how to make it stop. And by the time the city accepted that this was no longer an isolated incident, the movement had already begun to spread. By the time the number of dancers reached several dozen, Strasbourg could no longer treat what was happening as a curiosity. People were collapsing in public squares. Some were carried home unconscious, only to wake up hours later and resume dancing as if rest had changed nothing. Deaths were now being reported openly, though officials avoided speaking about them too directly, as if naming the problem might give it more power. Eventually, the city council intervened. They did what most authorities do when faced with something they don't understand. They asked experts. Physicians were consulted, men trained in medical knowledge of the early 16th century, and after careful discussion, they reached a conclusion that felt reassuringly confident. This was not witchcraft. It was not demonic possession. It was a natural illness. According to medical theory at the time, the dancers were suffering from overheated blood. Their bodies, it was believed, were attempting to release excess heat through movement. The dancing was not the disease, it was the symptom. And from that diagnosis came a solution that, at least on paper, made sense. If the body needed to dance in order to heal, then stopping the dancing would only make things worse. So the city decided to help. Stages were built in public squares. Musicians were hired. Drummers were brought in. The dancers were encouraged, officially, to continue moving, under the belief that the illness would eventually exhaust itself. In other words, Strasbourg responded to people dancing themselves to death by making the process more efficient. At the time, this was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as treatment. The results were immediate and deeply unsettling. More people began to dance. What had once been a frightening mystery now had structure. The dancers had designated spaces, music, even audiences. And with that visibility, the condition seemed to spread faster. Those who had resisted the urge to move now found themselves joining in, as if the body responded to permission more readily than restraint. Some dancers screamed while they moved. Others wept. Many appear fully aware that something was wrong, yet unable to stop themselves. When exhaustion forced them to the ground, they were lifted up again, sometimes by friends, sometimes by officials, and encouraged to continue. Deaths increased. Witnesses described people collapsing mid-step, their bodies simply giving out. The official response was to remove the bodies quietly and allow the dancing to continue around them. At this point, even the physicians began to doubt their own conclusions. Clergy, who had been pushed aside, re-entered the conversation. They argued that this was not an illness of the body, but a punishment of the soul. The dancers, they said, were cursed, victims of divine wrath who required spiritual intervention, not music. Caught between medical theory and religious fear, the city hesitated. Then, just as suddenly as it had been encouraged, the dancing was restricted. Stages were dismantled. Musicians were dismissed. The dancers were removed from public view and sent to a nearby shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a figure long associated with uncontrollable movement and affliction. There, away from the crowds, the dancing slowly began to fade. Not because anyone understood what had caused it, but because the city had finally stopped feeding it. By the time the outbreak subsided, Strasbourg was left with no clear answers. Only records, rumors, and the quiet awareness that their attempt to fix the problem may have made it far worse. And the most unsettling part was this. No one could say for certain whether the city had survived the madness or whether it had simply outlasted it. When the dancing finally stopped, Strasbourg was left with silence and no explanation. There was no official conclusion, no final report that neatly explained what had happened or why it ended. The city simply moved on, carrying the memory like something uncomfortable that no one wanted to examine too closely. Over time, historians, physicians, and psychologists would return to the event again and again, each convinced they could explain what the people of 1518 could not. One of the earliest explanations was physical. Some suggested that the dancers had been poisoned, unknowingly consuming rye contaminated with ergot, a fungus capable of causing hallucinations, convulsions, and loss of bodily control. The theory was tempting. It offered a clean, biological answer, a cause you could point to and contain. But it didn't fully fit. Ergot poisoning tends to incapacitate. It weakens the body. It doesn't usually produce coordinated movement for days or weeks at a time, and it doesn't explain why the dancing appeared to spread socially rather than randomly. Another explanation focuses on psychology. Modern researchers have pointed to mass psychogenic illness, a condition in which extreme stress manifests physically and spreads through groups. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under pressure, famine, disease, religious fear, and constant reminders of death. People lived with the belief that punishment could arrive at any moment without warning. In that environment, the body may have become the outlet, not consciously, not intentionally, but collectively. The idea is unsettling because it removes the need for poison, demons, or curses. It suggests that ordinary people, under enough pressure, can lose control together, not through panic, but through obedience to something internal they don't fully understand. And then there's the explanation that history avoids most carefully, that the outbreak was not just an illness, but a feedback loop. People danced, the city watched, authorities responded, and every response reinforced the behavior. By building stages, by hiring musicians, by legitimizing the movement as treatment, Strasbourg may have transformed private suffering into public ritual. What began as individual collapse became a shared experience, and shared experiences are powerful, especially when no one is allowed to question them. When the music stopped and the dancers were removed from view, the outbreak faded, not because the cause was cured, but because the attention was. What remains most disturbing isn't the dancing itself, but how familiar the pattern feels. A community under stress, a strange behavior that no one understands, experts offering confident explanations, authorities acting decisively and making things worse, and the population caught between fear and obedience. The people of Strasbourg were not foolish. They were not ignorant. They were responding with the tools they had, using the knowledge they trusted. It simply wasn't enough. 500 years later, the dancing plague of 1518 remains unresolved. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened. And perhaps that is why the story still unsettles us, because it suggests that under the right conditions, history doesn't need monsters. It only needs people. And sometimes, that is far more frightening. If this story stayed with you, a like or a subscription helps this channel continue telling forgotten ones.